if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, maybe you'll get sick of being the monster out of my head, under my bed. Think you're something out of my nightmares, standing right there. But if I lay down and I play dead and I stay dead, then will you get bored of killing me?
Silhouettes of you are like a taunt. Never really know just what you want. With you I don't ever feel calm. I can feel the sweat inside my palms. Play with me like cats and a string.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sandbox Debates with myself as the moderator tonight. This is going to be a debate with John Fisher and Benjamin Speed Watkins on Is Physicalism Evidence for God's Non-Existence? So we're going to get into that debate and listen to each one of their openings. But before we do, I want to go ahead and give a shout out really quick to the people that make this all possible. We have the Promethean Secular Frontier Patreon. Thank you to our patrons like Sunny Shell, Phil Calderone, Jena, Miyu, Linear, Mikey, Famine, Laura Magee, and Oz. This channel is here to spread and encourage reason, science, secular humanism. So please support our work on the Patreon. Help us make a better world, one thought at a time. Go ahead and hit the like button, the share button, try to subscribe if you can, hit the notifications so you know when the next show's coming out. But without further ado, let's bring on our debaters for tonight. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Pretty good.
Awesome. Good. You guys ready to have a very informative discussion tonight?
Oh, yes. Super excited.
Cool.
Very.
Cool. All right. So I guess we decided to let Benjamin go ahead and do the opening tonight. So we'll go ahead and hear from you first, and then we'll go to John Fisher and hear his opening, and then we'll go right into an open discussion. Okay? So let's get it on and get it started.
All right. Can everyone see my opening slide? And I cannot see you, so you have to...
There we go.
Yep, you can see it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, cool. So the question that as I see it tonight, that we have been invited to speak about is whether or not physicalism is evidence against God. And so I want to argue that yes, physicalism is evidence against God, and I will be supporting my position with some considerations from what's known as the mind-body problem, and then an argument that I've called the argument from physical of minds. So let's start with the mind-body problem. So the mind-body problem is a question about the relationship between our mental lives and the physical world. Problems arise when we draw a sharp distinction between mind and body. So as you can see on the screen, there's what's called an inconsistent tetrad. If we accept any of these three claims, then we can deduce the falsity of the fourth. So all four of these claims can't be true. We have to give up one of them. So those claims are that the mind is a non-physical thing, the body is a physical thing, and the mind and the body interact, and a physical and a non-physical thing cannot interact. And so again, all four of these claims can't be true. And this might seem kind of difficult to see at first. So think of it as our minds as being unextended substances. So the first claim is that, our minds don't have physical properties like size and shape and location. They seem to be unextended. While as our bodies are extended substances, they are things in the world that can bump around with other objects. And it seems that our minds and bodies interact. I can think about raising my hand, and I try to raise my hand, and my hand raises. But extended and unextended substances cannot interact. It's hard to see how something that's unextended can reach out and causally interact with something extended. So there's two broad traditions that tackle this problem. So there's the dualist tradition and the monist tradition. So dualism insists on a fundamental distinction between mind and body. So we are more than merely material. Cartesian or substance dualism is the view that minds and bodies are distinct substances. Because this view insists minds are non-physical substances, it's hard to understand how non-physical minds can causally interact with physical bodies. This is the interaction problem. It's also hard to understand why a non-physical mind cannot causally interact with some other physical body. This is known as the pairing problem. Now, contrast this with the monist tradition. Monism denies the sharp distinction between mind and body, and instead insists on a simpler view of a single substance. Materialism or physicalism is the view that fundamental reality is physical. Because this view insists fundamental reality is entirely physical, it's hard to understand the irreducible nature of minds. We could not know all the physical facts about the brain of a bat, but we could know all those physical facts, but we would still not know what it is like to be a bat. We cannot explain the mind in third-person terms. This is the hard problem of consciousness. So how do I approach this? So I consider myself something of a Hegelian these days, so I want to try to take what is true from the dualist tradition and the monist tradition while leaving behind the features of it that are false. So to use the cheesy Hegelian jargon, I'm looking to sublate these traditions or find a synthesis between them. And so I've settled on non-reductive physicalism. So according to non-reductive physicalism, the mind and body are two distinct ways of organizing or describing the same physical reality. This view denies the mental and physical are distinct substances. It instead claims first-person and third-person language games are two inseparable and mutually irreducible perspectives of a single substance. This view avoids both the interaction problem and the pairing problem, while also insisting the mind and the body are real and irreducible to one another. On this view, mental states like conscious experiences and personality are higher-ordered biological functions, like photosynthesis or digestion, except they must appeal to first-person subjective perspectives. So, this brings me to what I call the argument from physical minds. So we can take our inconsistent tetrad from earlier. So we are accepting premises or claims B, C, and D. And so we can infer the falsity of A. We're going to say that our minds are not properties of non-physical substances or souls. So I'm claiming there are no non-physical minds like souls because it's probable all mental changes have sufficient physical causes. Every mental event is caused by something physical. All mental differences imply physical differences. Nothing mental happens without something physical happening. And all mental properties supervene on physical properties. Minds imply matter, but matter does not imply mind. So how am I going to support these claims? So I have to give evidence. So I'm going to use 5 observations from neuroscience that I think support these theses that I just laid out. And so the first 3 of those is that given any known species of vertebra, directly stimulating a physical brain causes that brain to have corresponding mental experiences. Some physical injuries to brains make it impossible to have any mental experiences at all. Which mental capacities are destroyed by injury are correlated to the particular region damaged. For example, dementia is an injury to the memory region of brains. Fourth, development of mental capacities in any animal species, including higher-ordered capacities like personality, are strongly correlated with the increased neuronal complexity in embodied brains. And the last is that, and I find this one the most interesting, is that minds and their psychological traits are physically related by genetics. So how do these 5 evidences support my conclusion from the argument from physical minds? Consider these 4 claims. My 5 evidences entail or prove there are no non-physical minds. My 5 evidences make it more probable than not there are no non-physical minds. My evidences are each more likely given that minds are physical rather than non-physical, or my evidences make it probable on our total evidence that minds are physical rather than non-physical. So I hope it's clear to everyone that I'm not making this first claim. I'm not saying that these evidences entail my conclusion. I'm making an inductive argument, not a deductive argument. So the claims that I'm making are more like these three claims you see below you. The first being what Richard Swinburne calls a good P inductive argument, while the second is a likelihood judgment, or what Richard Swinburne would call a good C inductive argument. And while the last claim is a Bayesian argument, it's an argument on our total evidence. So we can see that the likelihood judgments applied here in the core of the argument from physical minds. The first premise is that necessarily purely non-physical minds imply purely non-physical substances. And the second claim is that it is more probable than not there are no purely non-physical substances. This is, again, what Swinburne would call a good P-inductive argument. Therefore, it is more probable than not there are no purely non-physical minds. So, what can we do with this conclusion? Is this conclusion evidence against theism? Well, I'm going to say yes, because evidence is a function of probability. And according to the law of likelihood, some observation is evidence for hypothesis H1 rather than H2, if and only if the probability of that observation given H1 is greater than the probability of that observation given H2. So let's let our observation be our conclusion that we just drew. Minds imply matter. Let's let H1 be atheism and H2 be theism. So the claim that I want to make is that the probability that minds imply matter is greater than on given atheism than given theism. So I have to make some assumption about what theism is predicting here. Does theism imply or predict purely non-physical minds? And I want to say yes, for at least 4 reasons. So the first is that God's mind does not imply anything physical. The second is that the world contains physical matter and our minds. And the third is that God created a physical world separate and distinct from himself. So from this, the conclusion is that theism implies at least one purely non-physical mind. But if you notice, my premise K here also attacks on an additional assumption to theism here that most theists make, and it's that our minds can survive our physical deaths. This is the idea that our minds can be unembodied and live an eternal life in heaven. That's not quite part of theism's simpliciter, so that's why I kind of put it off in these asterisks, put it to the side. But these 4 claims almost certainly imply that theism implies at least one purely non-physical mind. And so that's why I want to say that physicalism is evidence against God.
All right, that was really good. Very concise, to the point, and really laid out your case. So next we're going to hear John Fisher give his opening statement. Go right ahead, John, when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for hosting, and Ben, thank you again for participating. So I'm not doing this for wholly unselfish reasons. One of the reasons I did want to have this debate / discussion is because I actually think Ben's argument is very interesting, and I think it does deserve much more of a central focus from both the atheist and the theist side. Because the question before us is physicalism evidence against theism or for atheism? And that's really important because there are certain physicalists, that is Christian physicalists and even theistic physicalists, who do take a position that pretty much Ben would take. Human beings are physical creatures. Their body dies, they die, and so forth. But, they believe God can raise the body from the dead, consciousness continues, and there it's gone. Now, is that what we would expect from theism? I would actually side with Ben, and I would say that isn't what we would kind of expect from theism. But conversely, if some sort of dualism was true, or even a form of idealism, which Ben kept open here, would that be evidence for God or a theistic being, or a being just like him or similar to him? Well, conversely, if you take this as evidence, if you take physicalism as evidence against theism, then surely if the mind does exist and it has its certain relations to the body that exist in a set of laws, then it seems that's something we'd more expect on theism. Not necessarily, though. There are Eastern religions that might have a dualistic concept with reincarnation, but we'll set that aside. The point is, it seems like substance dualism is expected on theism, and it seems like a sort of physicalism is expected on a naturalistic atheist paradigm. So I'm not going to contest that. What I will contest is physicalism. Now, of course, because Ben took the affirmative, I'm not going to provide evidence for substance dualism in the sense of it's just going to completely destroy what Ben is offering. I'm just going to provide considerations that seem to be evidence for substance dualism, or even a sort of idealism. And on top of that, I'm going to provide some reasons why you should take it seriously or consider it and what it better explains. So the first point was the interaction problem, which is usually something people bring up. It's considered to be one of the hardest objections against substance dualism, at least going back to Descartes with Princess Elizabeth. And from what I've read of the history of it, the reason why Descartes really couldn't affirm it is because of his epistemology. Now, what do we mean by this? Descartes was pretty much an infallibilist, and as a classical foundationalist, he required his foundations to be basically irrefutable. And when it came to how to explain substance interaction between bodies and souls, well, the biggest issue was how exactly do we communicate that? Now, at the end of the day, causality does seem to be primitive. It doesn't really seem to provide any sort of more basic analysis, even to the laws of physics. Now, so for example, Bertrand Russell, he pointed out in an objection to causality that if you look at the equations in our best physics, they are symmetrical. One side of the equation is equal to the other side, whereas causality is asymmetrical. So for example, causes always precede their effects. So it's really hard to read causality in our best physics equations. You just don't read, and there's a cause. But it seems like if you just go about your day, causal language is pretty unavoidable. It's very hard to avoid. So we can say that these equations, while beneficial in helping us predict the world, they don't really contain or fully explain all our metaphysical presumptions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if these causal relations are just primitive, then there's really nothing to explain, or no real need to explain, the physical interaction and the mental interaction with one another. It's all just going to boil down to some brute law. So at the and this is a point even Hume could make against causality in general. So for example, when we see one billiard ball hit another billiard ball, we could always ask, okay, at what point did the cause happen? It's not something that we see empirically, it's something that we infer. So it's not something that we can call into question about just interaction between physical and mental causes, but even physical and physical causes. So that's the first point I would raise. The second point I would raise is Ben brought up a point from genetics, but genetics speaks to the development of the body. And if the body could have a genetic inheritance that causes issues with its interaction to the mind, then I think that just equally explains it. So whatever we would expect from it, and I grant that this is some evidence in favor of physicalism, but I don't think it fully overrides it, or dualism can't explain some element of it. So that much I'll fully concede. And the next part is some evidences for dualism. One is personal identity. On dualism, this seems to be a straight up easy explanation here. You are your soul. You are identified with that ontological substance and not your body. And consider the fact that you have parts, and these parts were arranged and taken out and put in from the fact you were a kid. You pretty much had none of your parts since you were like 5 years old. Yet you look in a picture and you would want to say, oh, that was me, and I am the baby. Like, we're identical, or infant. We're identical towards one another. So that's much easier to explain, whereas, the parts of the body just go away. And even if you want to say, well, it's more about psychology, well, if someone forgot all their memories, or at the very least severely damaged their memories where they were unrecognizable as a person, we'd still want to identify we'd still want to identify them with who they were before that accident happened. So there's that to take into consideration as well. And there's even an interesting thought experiment given by Richard Swinburne. Imagine if you had your brain split in half, and you were cloned, and you put your right side with the left side of the clone, and your left side to the right side of the clone. Bam! There are two physical yous. Which one is the original? We can't really say whether dualism is true or physicalism is true. What we can, however, say is what explains it is not going to be a physical fact, but a non-physical fact. Ergo, there has to be some aspect of us that is non-physical. So that seems to be, that continuity of identity seems to be much easier to explain on dualism. So that would be the first argument. And the second argument would be an argument put forward by Edward Fazer, and I believe it's just, I know the last name is Ross, but in any case, the argument goes like this. Physical properties are indeterminate, mental properties are determinate, ergo they can't be one another. So just to give evidence of both of these really quickly, when I say indeterminate, I mean, if you look at like a triangle, what could it be? What does it mean? It could mean that the person is pointing to triangles in general. If it's an isosceles triangle, then it could be all isosceles triangles in general. It could refer to the band triangle, which, yes, it's a Japanese pop band. But the point is, what you're looking at in terms of its meaning. It could have a lot of meanings that are just indeterminate between one another. But if you reflect on your own thoughts, when you're thinking about triangle, you know exactly what you're thinking about. So our thoughts are determinate. You can know what they mean, whereas the physical stuff is indeterminate. Now, if you think to if you think to an interesting thought experiment, and Ross puts this one forward, and he takes it from and he takes this from Kripke. Imagine if, for example, he was to ask you, every time you thought some number plus some number equals this other number, did you mean plus or did you mean quus? So quusing and plussing are different. If you add two numbers, the result is the sum of both numbers. If you quus, it's the sum of both numbers unless the number is over 57, in which case it's going to be 4. That's just the difference of the rules. Now, you never actually added up higher than the number 57. So how do you know every time you meant plus in the past, you didn't just mean quus? And given the fact that if we're presuming we're material entities, then what can we exactly point to that says, oh yeah, this is physical feature is exactly what corresponds to quusing versus plussing? You'd already have to know what the meaning is ahead of time. So those would be two arguments in favor of some sort of dualism or non-physicalism.
All right, so we've heard from from John on this, and very interesting, really interesting sides to the debate. So I really want to hear a really open conversation about it, so we can kind of dig into each point and see how they compare up. This is kind of where it gets juicy. This is where, we really get to where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, So when you guys are ready, fire away. Whoever wants to start first, you guys can kick off a conversation. We want to hear it.
So the first thing that I had on my list was the interaction problem. Do you want to start there? Did you have somewhere else you wanted to start?
No, the interaction problem is great because I think if you've ever taken an intro to philosophy course and you start on philosophy of mind, we're always going to start off with Descartes, and we're always going to start off with his discussion of Princess Elizabeth. At least that's been my experience. Ben,
It's my experience too. Yeah.
okay, we could both agree there. So now so let's actually start off with where the interaction problem starts off, because you could frame it in the sense that, the body and the soul don't share a common property, namely one has extension and the other doesn't share it, therefore how can they interact? Or do you think the problem is, or would you parse out the problem in a different way? Like, why don't we detect this in our best physics, something which Sean Carroll does, or something else entirely?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and because I think that it's going to depend on the history of how science has seen this interaction problem. So you're right, this problem arose with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia in a correspondence with Descartes. And I think at the time the tradition was to publish correspondence. You do this correspondence with the idea that it was going to be published. And basically just saying like, hey, how do these things interact? So I included the slide where we see mind as something unextended. It seems unextended. It doesn't have shape or size or location or these other physical properties, because those things seem like things that have extension. The property of being extended seems to have, and so it was just this conceptual problem. So I think Princess Elizabeth's argument is entirely a priori. But so as Newton comes on the scene, things are, and especially with people like Laplace, we're thinking of mechanical energy or a mechanical movement. And so it seemed like there was these, if it was independent of velocity and time, that quantities were conserved, and that this was just an interesting fact. And then along comes Joule's, the guy the units of energy are named after Joule's, shows that, mechanical motion is just heat. And so that all of these things are conserved. And then, magnetism comes around, and electric charge is a conserved quantity too. And so it was these three areas of science that kind of all converged on this one fundamental law of physics, the conservation of energy. This idea that energy in the universe is the same, it's constant. The total kinetic energy and potential energy of a closed system remains the same. And so that this goes all the way down, that this is a law that affects magnetism, motion, energy transfer, and that it applies to everything biological, everything like us, like our bodies. And so there was, think of a time when life just seemed to be this thing that was irreducible, this immanent vitality that's just in the physical world. But there was an interaction problem with that as well. And so the conservation of energy has just kind of ruled out these ideas like, look, there's something non-physical that can just reach in and deplete the net total energy of that system and itself. If something can't fit into the model of the conservation of energy, it just can't have causal influence in the world. Well, something unextended is just something that just you'd have to violate the conservation of energy in order to have mental effects on the physical world. Well, we observe the total energy in our bodies being constant. And so that's a reason, and there's the causal closure of the physical world. If you think that the physical world, the conservation of energy goes all the way down, then the total energy of the universe is constant. And so there just aren't these non-physical things that reach in and deplete the net total energy of the system. I'm at the point of rambling, so I get
it. So basically, the argument, and if I could distill it for you, is if the mind if there is an immaterial mind causally affecting the body, then the body would show. Then from the body, we would pick up signs that would break our best laws of physics. Namely, we would see all this extra energy we shouldn't be picking up from Newton and from all these physical, and from what we know of our best physics, at least on this level, but we don't pick that up. Therefore, we can kind of rule out that there is no interaction from this immaterial body reaching into the physical body.
So in lay language, yes. So rule out
Yeah.
might sound a little strong there, because you can
Yeah.
always still leave the question open. Like, hey,
Mhm.
how do you incorporate non-physical
Right.
properties into the conservation of energy? Can that be done? If someone could come along and demonstrate that it could be done. And so it's one of those kind of standing criticisms of, look, we don't know how to fit. This is the best model physics has to offer. This
Right.
idea that the conservation of energy is fundamental, it goes all the way down, and the universe is causally closed. How do we fit a non-physical cause into that? And we don't know how to do it.
Right. So I guess my response would probably be to dig into a little bit of skepticism, and probably Bertrand Russell's point that I kind of mentioned in my response to you. So this is kind of how Russell's argument works. So for example, our best physics are always spoken of in terms of mathematical equations. So force equals mass times acceleration. You're an engineer. Please correct me if I'm wrong so I don't make an idiot of myself. I'm good. I'm good.
You're good.
Okay, I'm good. So that's an equation, but it's symmetrical. Like you could put one side onto the other side. It works one way or another. That's not going to matter. Causality doesn't work that way, because from what we know of causality, we know that it's asymmetric. So the cause always precedes the effect. So for example, if you take me to court for hitting you in the back of the car with my car, then I can't say, oh, sure, I caused, oh, sure, it came at a time beforehand, but how do I know that it wasn't really Ben's car that caused me to ram it? Like, no, that's not how the temporal and the causal relations seem to work. So you can draw this kind of skepticism to causality itself, which is the very basis that the argument is made. And the only two responses I can think of is we do away with causality, in which case, who knows, maybe the best kind of fix is, I don't know, if you're a theist like me, maybe we become Malebranchians, maybe we're occasionalists who just think that God sets this stuff up and he's the real cause behind it. Or, we ditch causal talk out altogether, and in which case we're going to have other metaphysical issues. Why couldn't it just be the case that these equations are, very helpful, they make great predictions, but we're not really committed to any metaphysical assumption they might have?
Yeah, so I would want to point to the history of why did we come to this fundamental law of nature. So it wasn't that Laplace put all of this together or that Joule put all of this together. Like, these were very independent ways of coming to the same conclusion, of finding out that, hey, reality, when we're talking about motion, conserves all of its quantities. And so that when we talk about the world as far as electricity and electric charge, those quantities are conserved. And when we talk about energy and heat transfer, those quantities are conserved. And so you've got three independent lines of evidence all climbing the same mountain from different sides, to use Parfit's analogy that I'm so fond of. And so they converge at this fundamental law of physics. And so now we're left with a decision here. Are we a part of this fundamental law of nature that affects every part of life that we participate in, where it be the metabolism, the energy from the metabolism in our bodies and in our brains, to the motion of our bodies as we walk about, to the electric charges that allow all that, everything obeys this law except our minds. Well, why doesn't our mind, how is it that our minds can get away with this? How is it that they can, kind of rise above this conserved quantity and have mental effects? And so I'll grant Bertrand Russell's skepticism. I'll grant all of your skepticisms as well, because it does seem like, how is, this is a hard problem. but we also, one of the premises in my argument was that minds and brains causally interact.
Right.
And so I think if you just accept that
Mhm.
minds are physical, that mind is something, that conscious experience is something that's realized locally in brains, that this objection disappears. Because now we don't have an interaction problem. And in fact, it also gives us an answer to the pairing problem.
Mhm.
So that might be, now a good time to go into the pairing problem. I'll stop there. You respond, and then I'll go into the pairing problem.
All right, so this is good. Okay, so here we have a sort of question. We have these three independent lines of arguments. Now, it might be the case that, sure, maybe the soul just has this very sui generis, very unique way of interacting with things that just goes above and beyond the laws of nature. But here we have like three independent lines of evidence that kind of show that nothing else really does. The fact that you're trying to make it unique seems very ad hoc-ish. And, we at least have reasons to be skeptical. Yeah, sure, hypothetically, maybe it's a unique way, this unique way of interacting, but it's much more likely that, the body just is a much better candidate for the physical body, that the physical body is a much better candidate for its own conscious states than this immaterial substance that's allegedly interacting with it in its own unique way. Ben, is that like a fair characterization of the point?
That's fair, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so if you look at, and I believe Philip Goth goes into it, if you look at why exactly this model of mathematized science became very popular, and it goes back to Galileo, it's because it was made to separate questions of metaphysics from the physics, basically how to calculate bodies, and it's more based around utility than getting at these fundamental questions. And I perfectly grant that, yeah, there are lines of models that really don't take into account the mind, but yeah, it's not supposed to take that into account, at least on this reading of the history of science. Now, my reading might be wrong, and I think that's a bit of its own topic to get into, but I would say that would be kind of where my skepticism with this line of argument would be. And yeah, if with that said, we can go into the pairing problem.
Okay, cool. So
Yeah.
this problem is also closely related to the interaction problem, but let's concede that there is causal interaction between a non-physical substance and a physical substance. Let's just concede that. So let's imagine a scenario where we have two guns. And so one fires a bullet at target A. So gun A fires a target at target A. And gun B fires at target B. Now, the bullet from gun A hits target A, but why did it hit A rather than B? So we can give an explanation for, given the orientation of the gun, the location of the target, all of these, we have something there to explain why the gun A hit target A rather than target B, and vice versa. So we should have a similar explanation for mental events and physical events in our brain. So if my brain causes my arm to raise, why doesn't it cause your arm to raise? What is the explanation for why this non-physical substance can interact with my brain to raise my arm, but not your brain to raise your arm? And so you might say, well, because they're not physically related. Well, a non-physical thing isn't constrained by physics. That's the whole shtick with the non-physical substance, is that it's not constrained by these properties. But again, if we think, like I do, that the mind is a physical thing, like a higher order process, biological process that's realized in brains, this problem disappears. That those mental events have to occur in that brain, because mental events necessarily supervene on physical properties. So the physical that's why our minds are paired with this brain and not some other brain. So the pairing problem can concede, look, there is causal interaction between non-physical minds and physical brains. But there's no explanation for why one mind is paired with one body rather than that's a complete mystery too. So we have two mysteries. We have an interaction mystery and we have a pairing mystery. And so we started off with a mystery of mind and body, and we're left with two mysteries. So, whereas the monist just has the hard problem of consciousness. How do we fit mental experiences into the physical world? How do we make that a physical thing? And I grant, but it's only one problem. I'm solving the mind-body problem by raising one interesting problem rather than the dualist tradition that raises two really hard problems.
Oh no, this is good. All right, so I really like this point. So, and this kind of, and I would actually like to ask you a question in order to follow this up to further the discussion on the pairing problem. But just to say what you said, just so we're both on the same page here, and you can verify this. Look here, I'm alleged to be a soul, and yet I'm interacting with this body. Why am I not, I don't know, interacting with Ben's body? And why isn't he interacting with my body? Why isn't this like some Freaky Friday scenario? There seems to be some sort of psychophysical laws in place that constrain my mind to this body and Ben's mind to his body. Wherever I go, my mind is aware of wherever my body is. Wherever Ben's body goes, his mind is aware of where it's going. So it seems to be the case that there are some psychophysical laws, but what explains it? Well, if we're physicalists, that seems pretty straightforward. Bodies interact with one another under the same laws of nature, and there's really no further explanation. Bodies aren't unique to one another. They don't have any unique interaction. So we only really need one set of laws, whereas it seems like you need an extra level of stuff in order to explain the laws, the psychological laws, the physical laws, and the interaction of the psychological laws and the physical laws. So Ben, is that like a fair way of summarizing your points?
Sure, we'll go with that.
That's a no, but okay, good enough.
No, it's not. It's not a no. I mean, like there was, I obviously gave more. I gave an explanation of why we would need a solution to the pairing problem, but I don't expect you to summarize all of that. And so, if later on it needs to qualify, I will qualify it later. But you gave a summary. I mean, I can only expect you to say so much.
No, yeah,
in a summary.
That's fair enough. Okay, so just to raise an answer with a question, Ben, if you were convinced of substance dualism tomorrow, maybe based on like this very strong a priori argument that kind of washed away all your evidential concerns, but you were like, okay, I don't really have good answers to like the interaction problem, but whatever. But you were still a convinced substance dualist. Would you be much closer to being a theist based on our expectations from atheism versus theism, or would you say, okay, let's grant that dualism is true. It doesn't really tell us whether or not God exists, or even a being like God. Like, I'm kind of curious as to your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think I don't have much issue conceding that I think substance dualism is more likely given theism than atheism. I think that God would be at least one disembodied mind. So I mean that entails substance dualism to my mind. If God creates a world separate and distinct from himself, that's not in any way, he's not in any way dependent on it. Well, that's a dualism of substance right there.
Right.
And so I don't think atheism has any comparable entailment. I don't think you could say like, look, there's this claim that atheism entails that gives you substance dualism. So I think, I would concede that if substance dualism were true, that would be evidence favoring theism over atheism, other things being equal.
Okay, and the second thing I just wanted to bring up would be on your conception of concrete entities. So basically, a concrete entity is anything with causal powers. I'm a concrete entity. You're a concrete entity. Folks, if you're listening, your concrete entities on the computer, which is another concrete entity, giving sound, which is another concrete. Regardless, you guys know what a concrete
not
entity is.
abstract entity.
Exactly.
To define it negatively.
Yeah. So mathematical objects would be example of abstracta. Ben would hold moral truths would be an example of abstracta. But regardless, so here you would say that concrete entities are all and the way they are ultimately going to be brute. It's not going to come down to any form of necessity at that level. At the level of the abstracta, sure, but on the concrete, it's just going to be, at the end of it, there's just brute laws of nature. Like, would that be a fair statement?
It could be. So again, this is one of those issues where I go back and forth. So the laws of nature themselves might be necessary. There might be a necessary initial condition of the universe, or it might be all contingent. You know, the whole, it could have been the case that there was nothing at all. I don't know. I lean towards the idea that the universe is in some way necessary. It's necessary in the way that there's at least one contingent thing,
right?
It depends. It's a very deep. It's why is there something rather than nothing question that's very deep here. But I'll concede to you that this is contingent. We'll just, for the sake of discussion, let's concede it and see where we go from there.
Yeah, I also wanted to bring this up because I remember a very bad interview experience where someone was pushing the contingency arguments, and then I was basically trying to remember that, and so I'm not going to say who it was, but it was ultimately not good. But putting that to the side for now. So ultimately, if God was the one if God was the one foundational entity, he himself would probably be contingent. I know, Ben, if you were a theist of some kind, you'd probably be more in like the Swinburne camp. But ultimately, his free will choice for the kind of world he creates is going to be one where he decides the physical laws. And if he's going to introduce substances, which I think most likely we would expect given a sort of theism, then he's also going to introduce brute laws as well that pair bodies to souls, and that itself would kind of serve why it's happening. Because at the end of the day, we're either going to believe in God's brute will dictating these laws for the universe, or it's just going to be brute laws of nature. So I think causal pairings are just going to happen either way. This is kind of why I brought up the Humean example a little earlier. So what can you say to Hume when he says, why does the billiard ball, when one billiard ball hit another billiard ball, it goes forward? Why doesn't it stop the other? Or why doesn't it jump up in the air? Well, at the end of the day, you are going to have substances acting in this way and having these causal relationships. And, the explanation doesn't really go further from there. And if we have a sort of dualistic conception, which is most likely going to entail or most likely increase the probability of God, well, that's going to explain why he pairs certain mental objects with certain physical objects. So tentatively, that would probably be my response to the pairing problem. I would probably just take an approach to this, probably just try to get you at a stalemate.
No, it's fine because that's, where I would appeal to the parsimony of and simplicity of a monist view of a dualist view. You say, look, I just don't have to posit these additional laws. They already obey the same laws of physics. There aren't any additional laws. But fair enough. I don't want to use up all of our time here.
I think we have like an hour and a half to 2 hours, so I think we're good for time.
Okay. Oh, so do you want to keep here at the pairing problem or move on to personal identity? Because I'm super excited about that topic.
I could sense that, but I think the pairing problem deserves a lot more discussion. And no, I really like bringing up parsimony because that is an epistemic virtue. So for those of you who don't know, parsimony is just in reference to Occam's razor. Look, if you have two solutions and one is positing less entities, then and this is a very simplified version, there are other aspects to parsimony, but if you have to posit, let's say I have a theory where I explain a murder, and I just say it's one guy committing the murder, and I don't really need to posit a second guy. Ben comes in and says, it's not only a second guy, it was a guy and a unicorn. And whenever I ask, okay, what exactly does the unicorn add to this explanation, Ben? Like anything he could posit, I could just say, it seems to be the one guy. And also, it's a unicorn. We're not even sure these things exist. So, like, it seems like parsimony is cutting against the unicorn hypothesis. I think, Ben, would that be a fair way to state that principle of parsimony?
Yeah. So I would say that, look,
Yeah.
the hypothesis, the physicalist hypothesis that I'm putting on the table is more modest and more coherent, and so that it has a higher intrinsic probability. So it's more modest in that I don't have to posit this additional feature, this non-physical feature of the world. I don't have to posit these brute laws which govern why it behaves in one way rather than another. And it's more coherent in that I don't have something like the interaction problem. I'm not trying to butt heads with the conservation of energy with my view. So it's more coherent with things that we already know. And so that these are ways that support the monist tradition that I'm trying to defend, the non-reductive physicalist one, over something like a substance dualism that insisted on that sharp distinction between mind and body.
All right. This is good. So I should just restate my goal in this discussion. It's not necessarily to prove substance dualism. I don't even think I'm committed to it myself. I actually, if I had to be honest, I would probably take a hylomorphist view, but the reason I haven't been defending that one is because that requires a lot of going into Thomistic metaphysics, and it's not really necessary to undercut Ben making the affirmative. So
can I make a confession? Like, I still really don't understand this view.
Okay.
And can you give maybe a little? I know asking for a philosophy soundbite in a couple minutes can be a super dangerous thing to ask of someone, but can you give a little spiel for it, just so that listeners and myself can maybe wrap their head around it a little better?
No worries. So let's start off with this Aristotelian view of the world. So basically, it's a view that's centered around what's called a constituent ontology. So on this viewpoint, people are not only composed of physical parts, but also metaphysical parts. So what do I mean? So right now, I'm an extended body. Like, you can have measurements. You can basically break that down in mathematical terms. This is the quantitative stuff. Now, the qualitative stuff doesn't really seem to be as easy to break down. So, for example, you can describe, in terms of the color of my skin, you could describe it in terms of, how fast the light is bouncing off and going into someone's retina and that sort of thing. But we could also say that I have a property of beigeness. And beigeness is a constituent property of myself. But then again, so is the light that's reflecting off of me. So it seems like physical substances also have metaphysical parts as well as physical parts. So aside from colors like beigeness, from my voice, you hear a certain sort of sound. When you also have tactile feel you could have tactile feel of me. You could describe me as, I don't know, my skin is smooth, something like that. Essentially, the qualitative stuff is just as much a part of me as the quantitative stuff. So what does this mean for things like minds? Well, it also means that what's called the soul or the intellect is just as much a part of me, even though it's fully qualitative, as is any quantitative measure of myself. So, and it doesn't even exist, like some Cartesian dualists have a view where the mind is just like an infinitely small dot in the center of your mind that just goes everywhere your body goes. But on this view, the soul is actually from head to toe existent throughout all of you. If someone cuts off your arm, the arm is no longer a part of you. Hence, your soul no longer permeates through it. So on this view, basically, the soul is a metaphysical part of a human being. It's the part of the person that exists just like his heart or his brain is a part of him, except it's not located in one spot. It permeates the whole body. It's qualitative, and it's something that makes the person what they are. So, for example, if you look at any physical triangle, yeah, it has 3 sides, 3 corners. Same with any physical square. That would be the form of that shape. But likewise, there are certain qualitative elements that are just essential to being human. And by having that particular form, you are considered an instance of a human being. So it's the part of you that's actually human. And it also has this other element of existing throughout some bit of what's called potency. Potency just means the ability to be potentially one thing or another. So right now I'm potentially an elderly male, but I'm not actually an elderly male. I haven't taken up any of those qualitative properties yet. But because I'm a human being, I have that potential. And it's because I have a human form that exists in this pure potency that I can be said to be potentially elderly, but actually a regular adult male. And it's really hard to get into, but like this is why I just wanted to defend as a sort of Cartesian dualism, because it's easier just to say that's the body, that's the soul, and they interact, and let's go from there.
And just to get the conversation back on track, and just to sort of remind the audience, we're having a discussion on, is physicalism evidence for God's non-existence? So obviously these concepts are really deep and may be unfamiliar to a lot of people, but people may be thinking, well, how does this relate to the discussion? So we're just going to remind the audience this is what the discussion is still about,
right?
And we will continue from there. So you guys go right ahead.
So this form of dualism is propagated by most Catholics and most Catholic theologians. So many Catholics would even say that when you die, you no longer exist because you are a combination of a soul and a body. And when your soul goes off to God, it's actually not even you that's in front of God worshiping him. It's your soul. It just represents you somehow. And even this but because your soul exists and continues and it can be put back in the resurrected body, the person can still live. You have a soul that exists sans a body, and it seems to do the trick just fine. But it's not really what people think of when they think of dualism. They think like two substances, one physical, one immaterial, interacting with each other somehow, and that's just and I'm just going to defend that, and because that's the popular conception, and I don't even need to defend dualism of this variety either. I know Christians who take what's called an idealist viewpoint. So the simplest way of characterizing it is like from Bishop Berkeley. He would say that really the only thing that exists are souls and their perceptions. So basically, the reason my body exists is because God perceives it into existence with me. And everyone's soul just exists prior to their body. And basically, we kind of live in like a perceptual matrix. And when you die physically and you're in heaven, you're just perceiving other stuff and you're just perceiving a new location. So even on this viewpoint, we could still have theism. Physicalism is denied, and it seems to undercut the argument. And if Ben is looking for parsimony here, this is pretty much the most parsimonious explanation you could give. So between these 3 theories, it seems like we have viable alternatives to physicalism. Now, Ben, maybe you would want to reply here about why, even though it does seem parsimonious, you still think physicalism is just doing a lot more work here, and it's much better to take more seriously.
Oh, one question. Would solipsism be part of that too? Or
well, on solipsism
is an epistemic position.
Yeah.
Like where you just can't know anything other than the own contents of your mind, and so that you're skeptical about any contents outside of your mind.
Is there an ontological version of solipsism?
I mean, yeah, I guess.
So Randall
That would be
Rouser,
probably very, very, very
there
parsimonious.
that is, well, ontological parsimony is a bit different from epistemic parsimony. So, for example, solipsism, because it can pretty much explain everything as a perception, doesn't really seem to be explaining anything because it can't really make any unique predictions. It doesn't really have the power to do any of that. And any time that you try to ask about, what about your perception of other minds? Why don't you run into traffic if you don't think that there's anything other than your mind? Like stuff like that. You could always come up with some excuse or some reason why that wouldn't be okay. And if that's going to happen, then as simple as it is, it just leaves a lot unexplained. Here's an example. Imagine if we heard like a chariot coming, and we heard 8 hoof prints, and I said that's 2 horses on carrying a chariot, and somebody else said no, that's actually the horse of Odin who has 8 legs. Like, it's simpler. You have 1 horse, but it's so majestic, and we have to account for so much that any ontological simplicity of it being 1 horse is just outweighed by all the epistemic thoughts of it just being a very new, unique entity. So,
well, I'm very tempted to ask, and maybe you guys will get to it later, is like what predictions can be made from dualism to prove its case versus what sort of predictions does physicalism make or has made that proves its position or evidences that position. But I'm sure you guys will get to it. I'm just going to butt on out, man.
Yeah.
So do we want to pick up right there with that? You know, like what sort of predictions are we making? Because I'm trying to explain certain observations in the sense that I think that the monist view predicts them things. So the point that I really like is that psychological traits are genetically related. Like, we have mental properties that are just physically related by genetics. And so I'm not going to say that that's something like monism would predict a priori. I'll give you that. But it's definitely something like that's certainly more expected.
No, I'll grant you
monism.
In my first 10 minutes, I even conceded that to you. Like, I'm not saying it's all too unsurprising on even dualism, because it's still something which affects the body and the body interacts with the mind. But if it didn't happen, then the dualist doesn't really gain any. Then the dualist doesn't really lose out on anything. Whereas I think you would lose a lot more. So I think if your thesis puts a little more of its neck out there, that where it could be pointed out and it backfires, but it actually works out great for you. Yeah, I think that is actually something that I'd have to give more weightier consideration to your position. So I'd concede a lot of that.
So another interesting line of evidence, I think, is that what mental capacity is affected in any animal species, given the relevant similarities to brains, is that the region of brain that we stimulate or destroy is strongly correlated with certain, so dementia is damage to a particular region of the brain, not some other part of the brain, or it's a particular region of a brain. Do you think? Because I think that's predicted on monism. That's it's a priori, like straightforward. Like, yeah, monism would predict that. Like, if it has to be the case that these things are built up in little bits of physical stuff, then that's how it would have to be. Do you think that's surprising on dualism?
Certain forms of it, yeah. So, for example, if you think that dualism can answer the full function of memory, then I think that your thesis is just a little too much out there, because there are different elements of cognition that we're trying to explain with our dualisms. So, for example, if you're somebody like E.J. Lowe, who described himself as a non-Cartesian dualist, his position was that there's an immaterial self, but really it doesn't do much cognitive work. So there's the self, it's irreducible.
Is this the time to transition into personal identity? Is this the segue? Are you setting me up?
I think it is. So I would concede that your brain is actually doing a lot of the memory stuff, that your brain is doing a lot of the memory stuff. I agree that dementia does really rule out a lot of dualisms, especially the ones that want to say all of consciousness is just immaterial. I don't think I would go that far. For me, consciousness only explains two things: self-identity, so self-identity over time, which we'll get into, and a second thing is intellective power. By intellective power, I just mean the power to abstract universals. So consider this. In my mind, in your mind too, you could think about the concept of triangularity without thinking about a particular triangle. So, for example, you don't have to think of an isosceles triangle in particular or any individual sort of it, but you can think about triangularity as a universal concept. And this doesn't seem to be something that is material because universals, they don't really seem to be a material thing. They seem to be an immaterial thing. So you could think of blueness without thinking about anything that's blue. And, it just goes on. Even if, and Ben, I know you're a Platonist, so I'll maybe make an appeal to you. When you think about, two-ness, or the property of being two, or actually, when you think about our humanity or humanness, you're not thinking about like the perfect human, which is like this Platonic caricature, because the perfect human has lungs and breathes. But if you're an abstract property, you're not, or object, you're not going to really breathe or anything. So when we're thinking about abstract, I think that is an intellective power of the mind. I also think that the self qualifies as that, but I don't think that full-on cognition is going to be explained on substance dualistic terms. I would probably disagree with a dualist who is going to act that strongly, because different dualists are probably going to claim differences regarding what exactly the immaterial mind is doing. And of course, I do have some theological skin in the game here, because I need something to survive during the resurrection, which translates into personal identity.
So to throw another rabbit hole out there, is this intellect that so there's personal identity and there's the intellect, and that these are two things that are evidence for substance dualism over. Yeah. Does this involve a concept of free will in any way? Is the power to act part of the intellect, or the irreducible fact that is our personal identity?
Yeah, I do think that.
Big question, I know. Sorry.
No. Yeah. I really can't say. So when it comes to free will,
I know it wasn't a fair question. It wasn't really a fair question for you to answer on the spot.
No, the hard thing with me and free will is I just think agent causality can't really be broken down that much either. So if I were to break it down to some faculty or something, as opposed to it's just something the agent in toto does, then I don't know. I think I would probably be just giving up a lot of my notion of agency. So I don't really think I could think of a way to explicate it fully on the spot, and I don't think I really need to. All I need to say is the agent just chooses to do something. However that works out, I'm going to be a bit agnostic on. I'll be a quietist about it.
Yeah. So the other consideration that you were claiming was evidence for substance dualism was personal identity. And so for the audience to give, this is a really super interesting question in the philosophy of mind that I just am absolutely obsessed with. And it's the question of what makes us the same person through time. What is the fact that makes it the case that there was this person in the past that went to the University of South Carolina? What makes it the case that there will be some person in the future that will be me? And so there's four broad solutions to this problem in philosophy. The first is that I'm my body. The fact that makes me the same person through time is facts about my body. The second view is that I am my brain. It's facts about my brain that make me the same person through time. The third is that it comes from Locke, the idea that I am my memories. Mm-hmm. It's how I remember things through time. That's the fact that makes me the same person through time. And the fourth is that you're a soul, that you are a non-physical substance that remains with you through time. And it's facts about that irreducible, non-physical entity that makes you the same thing through time. And so I take a very modified Lockean route. So I don't think that these views start to disagree in imagined scenarios. So John gave a really good one, the brain transplant one. Derek Parfit has a famous one, the teletransporter. It's very Star Trekky sounding. Thought experiment in philosophy, so that's super cool too. Philosophy and mainstream nerdism are interacting there. And so in these imagined scenarios, this is where those views disagree. And so my view is that of Parfit's. It's that what makes us the same person through time is what he calls strong connectedness, or he calls it relation R. It's this idea that I am psychologically connected with a past person, we call it a personite, and through time these change, and that there is some future being who is psychologically connected to me in that relation R way that makes it the case that some future experience will be me. And within relation R contains everything that matters about personal identity. What we think about as the irreducible soul or something, this idea of this continuation through self, is actually not what matters. So this is very close to the Buddhist tradition that denies that that we have a self, that the self is an illusion, and it's because of these false beliefs about the soul that cause much of our suffering. And if we didn't have these false beliefs about the self, that we would minimize suffering. So my response to John's argument is that I don't think that personal identity is evidence for substance dualism over monism, because I think that this relation R, the idea that this strong psychological connectedness, and that is something physical, that doesn't, I don't have to imply anything non-physical for that view to be true.
Oh, okay, I see. So basically you're saying, okay, so basically how I said, okay, I agree with the premise that if physicalism is true, that's evidence against God, but I'm just not going to say physicalism is true, or at least I have good reason to doubt that it's true. Ben, from what I understand, what you're saying is, I'm just going to do the same thing with personal identity here. I have no good reason to believe that personal identity is true, let alone evidence that needs to be explained.
Well, no, I am saying that personal identity is true. I'm just saying, I'm not saying, I don't think the question should be, do we have do we have a self or not? What sort of thing is it? Right. And so I would want to say that we have false beliefs about what the self is, this idea that it is an irreducible soul that continues through time, that is the same thing through time. That's the piece. I don't think our soul is that. And so my view doesn't have to postulate something over and above the physical, psychological connectedness or relation R. So to help simplify it, I'm an anti-reductionist about the mind, but I'm a reductionist about personal identity. I don't think that experience can be reduced to third-person terms, but I do think personal identity can be reduced to third-person terms.
Okay, that explains it. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, no. All right. So I guess my first point would probably be to undercut some of the evidence that you're using to support this claim. So when you say personites, I'm guessing that this relies on like a B-theoretic approach of time or an eternalist block of time where each person exists at the time slice and they're causing something in the additional personite that transfers over. Would that be how I understand it?
Yeah. So I wasn't necessarily presupposing the B over an A theory or a tensed or tenseless theory of time. However, it certainly seems that model fits better within. And so we'll put B theory on the table, that it's the idea that, look, there was a person psychologically connected to me, but there was a person in the third and between the third and the fourth grade, whenever that was in the 90s. And that I am not the same person as that is a different person. I am importantly psychologically connected to it in certain ways, but I'm not the same person that I was when I was between third or fourth grade. I am a different person now.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is going to be a bit difficult because, well, not for me.
Super
No,
abstract. Questions of personal identity are
they
mind warping like this.
They are. But okay. So, all right. So I do want to push back maybe with some arguments because I'm not a reductionist about the self. I don't think that it can be reduced to third person terms, and I do think that there are certain commitments. So, for example, it seems like so one argument. I seem to have some sort of commitments to myself that are stronger than to other persons. So, for example, just take one off the top of my head. I have a commitment. To provide myself food and shelter. So I don't have to provide everyone food and shelter, but it seems like out of all the people I have to provide food and shelter for, is myself. That seems to be a moral commitment that I think you would probably agree with, and it seems to be prior to support of anyone else. And when I think about the reasons why, it seems like there's the practical reason, which is we can't really expect people to support each other without, first supporting oneself, but also, to recognize that if you don't support yourself, why should anyone else do it? Like, why should anyone else recognize value in you if you don't first do it first? So it seems like there's a sort of commitment to your own life there that we start off with, and then we kind of build to other people. So would you say that that's not a moral commitment you would agree with, or do you think that there's some kind of error in the moral reasoning?
I know. So I think I would accept that moral reasoning. I'm still trying to see why that would imply an irreducible fact about personal identity. I'm not making that connection because I would want to resist such a connection in saying that, look, when I was in the 3rd and 4th grade, I might have made a promise to a girl on the playground to marry her. However, I'm not the same person now that I was then. I'm not beholden, I'm not importantly psychologically connected to that promise such that I have some moral obligation to marry this girl that I asked to marry me.
Doesn't that make you a liar, sir?
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah. So,
Get out.
Makes you a liar.
We don't dialogue with liars, sir.
But I think we could say that we're no longer responsible for promises we've made like that, precisely because we've changed as persons. Like, we're no longer the same person, and then we could explain why we don't have that responsibility to a promise we made in that context. So we just made it a not so wise decision in the 3rd and 4th grade.
Yeah, but I think the easier explanation is I just didn't have the cognitive faculties at the time to know what exactly marriage is and what the commitment is, and I didn't really have the resources to even think about doing it. I'm not even my own guardian at that age. Now, if we were to flip it, like, let's say, right, I'm in my 50s, I talk to my kids and I say, guys, this is what your inheritance is going to be. I'm going to leave you with this money. You guys use it, take care of yourselves. And I make that promise at 50. I'm 90. I become a miser. I become a Scrooge. I don't really care for my kids that much. I basically want to be buried with all of my money. Now, of course, I think at that point, we all agree we should just get out the guillotine for such a person. But that's not my point. My point is, it seems like the promise that I would have made at age 50 would count to ensuring that that what I was offering or promising my kids would stay to them. It seems like this is indispensable for moral promising.
Well, so I just say that I'm psychologically connected in important ways. And again, I said, relation R contains everything that matters.
Right.
And so I would just say, I do what I do because of who I am. And that's a claim about personal identity. But it's also true that who I am changes through time, that I'm not the same person that I was in the 3rd and 4th grade. And so if I've made that promise, because of who I was at the time, and now I'm a different person, the decisions I would make now because of who I am are different. I'm going to make different decisions. And so I may not have made that promise in the context of when I'm 50 years old, or, making promises to my kids. And there's still, all of that can be accounted for in relation R. My trouble comes is why do we have to have this extra non-physical fact in order to make these moral claims about promise keeping, or by saying that certain people are praiseworthy or blameworthy for their actions by not living up to certain moral obligations? I guess I just don't see, like, what is a non-physical soul doing for us in that picture? When I lay it all out, I don't know where in the picture I'm supposed to be putting that.
Well, if I'm going to pause it, I could at the very least say I had kids at age 30. I made a promise to them at age 50, and I backed out of that promise to my kids, the people I'm supposed to hold most dear out of most other people because of our filial connections. And that's a grave moral injustice. Whereas if I was the 90-year-old, I took your position, Ben, why wouldn't I be in my right to say that was some other person who had kids at that age, and that was some other person that made the promise. That wasn't me. If I would have known the vast importance of money and how much this is a legacy and a testament to me that deserves to be shown off and put with me in the grave, I would never have done those things. I would have spent more time just making money. Like, those are all I statements, and they betray a sort of moral reasoning that I would say is fallacious. But at the very least, I can say is what he's making based on the sort of metaphysic that you're claiming here. That no, you did have those kids,
so
you did have that money.
Between 30 and 50, he would still have relation R, and so maybe in relation R he had a brain tumor, and so these behaviors are because of something within relation R that has caused him to act in these ways, such that he can't keep the promises that he made. But there's also another related point, that the reason that he has obligations to his children is not entirely because he made a promise at 30, but because he has obligations as a parent to take care of his children. And so that if he's just letting them down, and that's regardless of whether he's made a promise or not, he's still letting his children down in a way that is, I would claim, morally relevant. So there's two different points here. The first is that relation R, the psychological connectedness between 20 and 50-year-old, is strong enough. It contains everything that mattered. It would contain that broken promise in a way that mattered morally. But it would also matter morally because he failed to take care of his kids. Like, he's making a decision that goes, treats his kids in a way they could not rationally consent to being treated. It's a way that would be disallowed by principles that no one could reasonably reject, and that would make things go impartially best. So that's why what he's doing is wrong. And so I think I can assign, without anything non-physical, I can say that his breaking of his promise was wrong, and that his living up to the type of person that he could have been is vicious. He wasn't a virtuous person. He became a vicious Scrooge-like person, and that's a moral failing on his part. I don't know what else again, if I put the non-physical soul there, I'll give you a non-physical soul. I don't think that changes anything about the moral reasoning. I just said, you take away the non-physical soul, I don't think anything changes about the reasoning.
Right. Well, I mean, I think a few things change. All right. So the first thing that would change is he can't really deny his history with his children, and he can't really deny his personal history.
Psychological connectedness over time. You can't deny that. I'm totally with you.
Yeah. He can't deny those things, but if there is a psychological connectedness over time, it's because he was the one who committed the actions. And I guess we're probably getting into a free will discussion here. But chances are, if I'm to be held accountable for an action, shouldn't I have been, and notice the word I, shouldn't I have been the one responsible for that action? If me and you are not the same person, And now you could also obviously say we have no psychological connectedness. But me and you are not the same person. And if you were to do something, and I don't think it would be right for you to blame me for it, given the fact that we're not the same person. Now, you could say, but we have no psychological connectedness. And I agree. But I think the other point is, if we accept the dictum ought implies can, then how is it the case that you can be held to what somebody else did? When how is it the case that you ought to be held for having kids when you could not help but be the person who you could not help but not be the person who had those kids? Sorry, that's a bit confusing.
Yeah, so I would just concede it. So I'm a compatibilist about free will. So I think that there is a coherent sense of could have done otherwise that is compatible with causal determinism. And so I would say that we can't be ultimately responsible for our acts, that we can only be partially responsible for our acts. And I would appeal to ought implies can. I would say we do what we do because of who we are. And so in order to be ultimately responsible for what we do, we'd have to be ultimately responsible for the way we are, but we can't be ultimately responsible for the way we are. Therefore, we can't be ultimately responsible for our acts.
Right. So, oh man, this is just really getting into a lot. So
It's a rabbit hole, I know.
Yeah, I know. But that's the thing with personal identity. It's like the viewpoint of like a realist conception of personal identity is usually really intertwined with the libertarian free will. At least I think they're just very natural bedfellows. But in any case, here, when you say can, do you mean can as in, it's modally possible, that is, there's no contradiction in saying you can do otherwise, or do you mean it like in a heavier sense?
So I mean it in, we'll call it a hypothetical motivational sense rather than a categorical sense. So it's not the sense that I could have broken the laws of nature and done other than the way I was. What I mean is that there's a hypothetical sense in which if things had have been different, I could have acted differently. So this does undermine kind of retributive conceptions of responsibility and then the idea that people can deserve punishment. I think that at the most we can want people to understand the wrongness of their acts and then into morally acceptable ways have nothing to do with them if they don't. I think that the desire for revenge, while it's a natural human emotion, is not rationally justified. I would even go like, and it's a super extreme claim, I know, but I don't even think people can deserve to suffer. Like I think that suffering is just in itself bad, and that to say that someone can deserve to suffer for its own sake, that someone's own suffering is in itself good, I just don't make any sense. I don't think it makes any sense. I think the type of responsibility that we would need for that to be true, we just don't have that kind of, that we didn't need that ultimate responsibility in a way in which we could be ultimately responsible for the way we are. And I just don't think we can do that, regardless of if God exists or not. If God is sovereign and created us, he created us the way we are. We can't be ultimately responsible for that either. So this puts me in the universalist camp. We can't deserve punishment because we just can't be ultimately responsible for the way we are.
Well, who has two thumbs and loves retribution and hellfire? This guy. Okay. So, all right. You know what? This is in terms of, the philosophy of retribution and where or even if it has a place is debatable. But I'm just going to give.
We're getting way off topic. I know we're supposed to be talking about is physicalism evidence against God. So I should probably rein that in.
Right. I think ultimately, okay, how about this? I think we should conclude that if you have a very full-blooded, realist conception of personal identity like I do, then you should hold this as evidence for dualism or some sort of dualism. And if you're more sympathetic to a reductionist viewpoint of personal identity, you should chalk it up with Ben and say this isn't really good evidence on behalf of
it's a great way to end it. I could not have said that better myself. Look at us finding common ground.
Yeah, it's really nice to know where the presuppositions are here.
Right.
Now, I did make reference to one more argument, and it's one that's seldomly discussed, but I think it's worth discussing, which was the Phaser-Ross argument. And we do have half an hour remaining. Scott, are you good with us going a detour here? All right. So this is.
I'm good with it.
All right. So this is kind of how the argument goes. The first premise is the meaning found within physical objects is indeterminate. So what do I mean by this? Let's say you're walking out on the street and you see, a triangle drawn in the concrete in chalk. Now, what does it mean? Now, what is the meaning of this? Now, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, when the person drew this, they meant to draw a triangle. Okay, maybe so, but another hypothesis is they meant to draw an arrow. Another hypothesis is they meant to draw an isosceles triangle, because that's exactly what it was in. Another hypothesis is they meant to draw the symbol from The Legend of Zelda, the one with the Ben, you're muted.
The Triforce.
The Triforce symbol, but they just forgot to do the one in the middle because, maybe it was a kid and they were called back home to lunch. Basically, you could posit all these things that were meant by this, but the meaning is ultimately left indeterminate. And you can have philosophers like Quine here who said ultimately translation is always underdeterminate. Or indeterminate and underdetermined don't mean the same thing, but they basically go to the same point here. If you're in the woods and you hear a native say gabagai and they're pointing to a rabbit, that could mean rabbit. But then again, they could be pointing to it and mean female rabbit. Or they could point to it and mean white rabbit because the rabbit is white. Basically, you could always postulate other meanings. So the translation game is always, in this sense, underdetermined. You hear a sound, you associate some meaning from it, but unless you actually are in the headspace, you're not really going to have a definitive answer one way or another based on, the physical signs and significations that go on there. But if you go to mental content, that is mental content in your own head, and you're thinking, triangle. Well, you know what you mean. You know what you mean when you mean plus and other more formal signs like addition or modus ponens or what have you. So it seems like these two things are not really compatible with one another. And to kind of hammer home why they're not compatible, think of it like this. Suppose you had this skeptic who asked you the following question. Whenever you've carried out equations and you said 2 + 2 is 4, 5 + 5 is 10, so on and so forth, how do you know when you said plus, you didn't really mean quus? And quus here is the same as plus in terms of how it functions in mathematics. The difference is if you add two things that are 58 or over, then the sum is just 5. So it has a very unique quirk. Now, of course, what can you point to? And that's physical. Well, you can't really point to brain states because the brain states that are associated with the meaning is always going to be underdetermined. You can do, and the same thing, because let's just go back to the Quine point there. And obviously, you can bring in other thought experiments that show this indeterminacy. I won't get into any other ones unless it's really required here. And the only thing you can go to is your past experiences. Well, every time I've done this is what I've meant. Well, if you're going to link it to something that's physical, then it seems that point is always just going to be underdeterminate. So unless you're saying that that's a non-physical fact, you're going to have to concede that there is some sort of dualism you're going to need to appeal to. And I think that could, and this shows that there's this vast difference between what's going on in your mental life and what's going on in your physical life, such that these are just two non-overlapping things. Now, maybe there's another sort of dualism we could appeal to, but dualism seems to be the default place we should be going, or at the very given the non-identity of these two things. So Ben, is there any place you'd like to start? Because there's a lot to unpack there. Ben, you're muted.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll just kind of dive right on in because this is kind of the first time I'm encountering this argument. I think I've heard someone else mention it sometime in the past, but I certainly haven't read Fazer and Ross's paper on this.
I can send it to you. I'll send you a link in Twitter.
Definitely send that to me so that I can read it over at some point. Because to recap, I defended a non-reductive form of physicalism. So why is that? Why do I have to put this qualifier non-reductive? And it's because I claimed that when we try to describe the physical, we need two different language games. We need a mental language game and a non-mental language game. So the least misleading way I've found to characterize this is we need a first-person language game, one that describes our first-person subjective experiences of the world, and we need a third-person language game. That third-person language game is the language game that we find in science. This idea of stripping away all of the subjective experiences and being left with a third-person objective view of the world. But then there's the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. How do you describe consciousness in third-person terms? You can't. It's irreducible. I'm a non-reductive physicalist because I don't think we can reduce it. And so it sounds like this argument is coming from the philosophy of language. And so it's this idea, like, hey, it looks like there's something, we can't explain why this is the case without in purely third-person terms. If we appeal to concepts of third-person terms, we're going to be left underdetermined. It's going to be underdetermined. We need to make reference to a language game that has first-person terms into it. And so my view just concedes that. It just says, yes, part of the physical, in order to describe the physical entirely and to leave nothing out, you're going to have a language game that appeals to an irreducibly subjective first-person language game. And so that's just how you go about solving this problem. Now, I'm sure Ross and Fazer have much more to say about this. I'm sure they don't just leave anti-reductionists out in the water. I think there's something about this that they think, no, it requires an extra substance, something else, something above a third above a physical reality. It has to be a non-physical reality, something that's not part of a causally closed system. I think I'll concede that I just don't know why this commits us to this something that's beyond a causally closed universe.
Right. So all that is great. And I think that does touch on the different camps of physicalism, because earlier in this, I kind of outlined the different camps of non-physicalism. You could be an idealist. You could be a dualist who isn't an interactionist like Malebranche. You can, there are positions on my side of the fence as well. I'm not sure where panpsychism falls. I think
it's a physicalist. It's a subset of physicalism.
Okay.
So it's the idea that just mental experience goes all the way down.
Okay, mental experience goes all the way. Okay, the point is here, both camps have these various viewpoints. Now, there's actually a really big concession that Ben has given. Now, ultimately, he's given this concession not because he's taking it lightly, or because he just saw my argument and it just blew him out of the water. Ben, you already have good arguments for being a non-reductionist, but there is something. Hegel, but there is a point here, though. If Ben wants to say, okay, fine, these forms of physicalism don't work, and this argument kind of undermines it, or similar arguments, then Ben is kind of stuck. Then Ben, wouldn't it be fair to say that you're kind of stuck here with only a subset of physicalism that could be explanatory? That is to say, you have to take up an auxiliary hypothesis that not only is physicalism true, but a non-reductive form of physicalism. And doesn't that kind of undercut the overall probability? You understand probability theory more than I do, so I'm going to let you explain that.
Well, so it's ultimately that's going to come down to semantics too, because my view is committed to monism. So this idea that there's one substance. So that's my view. So I've described my view in the past as neutral monism. I found that way to be. People have, I've flirted with property dualism because in a way there's a lot of overlap in these views. But I think the least misleading way for me to characterize my view is as a non-reductive physicalist. But the point that I'm getting at is that there's only one substance. That when the parsimony of my view is that there's one substance. So instead of having the two problems with dualism, the pairing problem and the interaction problem, I have just the one hard problem of fitting irreducibly subjective first-person experiences into my concept of what the physical world is. And so I think that's the challenge. That's where the non-reductive physicalism comes in. I have still the one problem to solve. I'm avoiding the two problems with dualism. So does solving this one problem count against my monist view? I don't think so. At least not in a way that outweigh, because on the other side, there were two other big problems that we have to solve somehow. And so at the end of the day, I think the evidential chips are still going to fall in favor of my thoroughly monist view of just one type of substance that's physical.
All right. So maybe as a clarifier also, since it's mostly monism you're relying on, and since, idealism, even a theistic form of idealism, is a sort of monism, would you say that even like a theistic idealism would fit into the monist camp?
Yeah, it depends. So that's because I think that idealists, people who think that there is no physical world, everything is mental, are going to have to concede some theologically unpalpable things about God and creation. You're not going to be able to say something like God created a world separate and distinct from himself, because he made it out of the same stuff he is, mental stuff. And so that there is no this distinct other type of stuff. And also just seems like there is a material world. Like, just like I am granting that, hey, look, it does look like there are irreducibly subjective experiences. If we are consciously aware that we are conscious, yeah, there is consciousness. Well, I think there is a material world. Like, it just seems like there is these things called material objects that don't in any way depend on the mental activity that we find in our first-person subjective experience. It just
Here's
really
one hand.
does seem.
Here are my hands. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a material world. I'm trying to remember who it was. Read Berkeley. Yeah, and he kicked a rock, and he was and I refute Berkeley just by kicking the rock.
I think it was Samuel Clark.
It might have been. I can't remember. I'd have to go check my history. I don't want to say the wrong thing because I would just get destroyed in the comments.
No worries. But yeah, that's why I always say I think or I believe. It saves you some extra humility. Right. So I guess at that point, I think the particular problems come in with objections for sorts of irreducible forms of physicalism. And this is why I kind of like eliminativists, because they just agree with me that the body can't produce the mind or intentions. Therefore, let's ditch this whole thing. But whereas I just say it exists as a separate substance, they say it doesn't exist. In any case, there's some overlap between us. But I guess one point of contention is I don't see why we would have to posit that the mental or our mental lives have any influence on our physical lives when it does seem to be the case. So, for example, epiphenomenalism is the view that the mental doesn't affect the physical, but the physical affects the mental. So, for example, I want to show you guys that I can lift my arm up as an example, and look, it's coming right up there. It's just rising, and it rose, and I believe I was the person who raised my arm. I had mental states that caused the rising of my arm. They just went up. And if that's the case, then it seems my mental life has an influence on my physical life. Whether we want to say that's substantive or whether, like Ben says, it's just one aspect, it not being reduced to another aspect. But on your viewpoint, Ben, I just don't know why we would need to postulate that the mental side has any influence over the physical side. Why couldn't I just be a body who has the thought I want to raise my arm and is just raising the arm independently? Like, Just similar to that. That seems just as counterintuitive. Well, not just as. It's less counterintuitive, but still counterintuitive to, let's say, an idealism.
Yeah, so I conceded this point at the start. So part of my inconsistent tetrad, the 4 claims, is one of them that I used in my argument against dualism is that minds and bodies interact with each other. So that this causation goes both ways. If I'm thirsty, that causes me to, if I have the experience of being thirsty, that causes me to get up and get a glass of water. If I take some sort of drug, it can have effects on my brain. I can be lethargic. I can be tired. I can, it has effects. The causation runs both ways. And so I just kind of conceded that as one of my starting points. Like that's something that I want in my view to accommodate. And so that's why I'm not an epiphenomenalist. I don't think that, we have to worry about this idea of over-determination in mental causation because it's still just the physical world. Our mental experiences aren't these causally inert features like foam on the ocean sea, on an ocean wave. No, they're actually part of the physical world. Like if we want to describe the physical world in its entirety, in itself, physics is silent about what the world is like in itself. The only way we can do that is by appeal to a language game that's irreducibly first person.
So for the audience sake, epiphenomenalism, well, you will get to that too, but epiphenomenalism versus emergentism, they sound very similar. Like, kind of like steam coming off the train is the consciousness coming off the brain, but
or like shadows.
The steam doesn't have any. Yeah, right.
Yeah, like, my hand can cause a shadow, but a shadow can't cause
your hand. Right.
Yeah.
So how is that different than, say, emergentism, like that consciousness emerges from the brain?
So emergentism is this idea that it's a higher ordered property of parts in a certain configuration. So you're not going to have mental properties at the base level. You're going to have to put the base level is going to have to be organized in a certain way such that those mental properties emerge from that complex physical structure. That's what we mean by emergentism. Epiphenomenalism, so that's on the origin. How is it that minds come about? That's an origin question, historical question. But there's an ontological question of what is mind? How does it fit into the world? And epiphenomenalism is one of the views that you can take within. It's a subset of physicalism. It says, look, there are these mental experiences, and they don't break the conservation of energy, but that's because they just don't have any mental effects at all. They're like a shadow in a hand. The causation only runs one way. Bodies affect minds, but minds don't affect bodies. And so, but that was when I laid out the mind-body problem. That was, we want to say, it seems like we just have such strong, overwhelming evidence that minds do influence bodies. Like if I want to raise my hand, I think about raising my hand, and my hand raises. If I'm thirsty, that causes me. And there's other interesting objections.
Neuroplasticity, yeah.
If mental states don't have any causal role to play, it's really hard to give an evolutionary explanation of why we have these experiences at all. And we're actually super lucky that, we all have the experiences we do for the things that happen to us that we do. Because it could have been, what if, evolution gave us conscious experience, like when we mated, like it felt like nails and sharp glass or something. We're just lucky that all of our mental experiences aren't excruciatingly painful. And then you say, well, those wouldn't it wouldn't matter.
Is there any, in physics, is there any, physical properties or certain configurations that you can predict where consciousness would arise? Like, can a scientist say, well, we know that if you put this together with this in just this right order, then we'll get consciousness. They do the test, consciousness arises. Is there anything like that?
Well, you get behavior. And so
Yeah.
you'll obviously behave in ways in which you have to infer, this is the problem of other minds. How do we even know if other beings are conscious? And these are fun experiments in the philosophy of mind, what's called P zombies, philosophical zombies. Can there be a being that's exactly like me? And if you ask them, you're like, hey, are you conscious? And they're like, yeah, I'm conscious. But in reality, they don't have any conscious experience at all. Like, is that sort of being metaphysically possible? And if it is, it seems like that refutes a strong form of physicalism right there. It says, okay, if that's even logically possible, that there is a philosophical zombie, that rules out a very strong form of physicalism. And those are always, it's an interesting question, but you have to turn to philosophy. You're not going to, neuroscience, they're not going to be able to settle this question.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
It seems like a hard problem, like what neurons are responsible for the taste of chocolate or vanilla? Like what?
Yeah.
Like how does taste come from those neurological properties or neurons? Like I can see where the mind-body problem comes from. Like you can't really predict where beyond behavior, like before you even get to behavior, we're talking about even more primitive than that, just the experience itself. Where does experience come from?
So I have a very interesting position. If I couldn't be one of the positions on the philosophy of mind that I take very seriously is Mysterianism. And if I was a naturalist, I'd be most inclined to Mysterianism. So Mysterianism is just the view that because we evolved to learn about third-person objects and the external world, that actually best explains why we just have a very poor understanding of our own internal life. That isn't as necessary to learn because it's always just immediate about us in third-person terms. So basically, we've only evolved a set of tools that's for the external world and things of that nature. You don't really, for all you know, the same thing could have, your same data would have been just as useful in a world of P-zombies as it would be, who faked intentions as it would be in a real one. But obviously, that's ridiculous, either because P-zombies don't exist or because it's just so against our common sense. But the point is, because of this, it explains through evolution why we have such a limited cognitive tool set to actually explain why all this is happening. And I think that mystery often gets a bad name, but it really shouldn't. As long as you could explain why there is, in fact, this mystery. So, for example, this language where one thing is just not irreducible to another. I think it makes much more sense on dualism because if there is no ontological reducibility between the physical and the mental, then that's going to explain why the languages don't reduce. But Ben, I think you could probably just take a fairly similar position that I did, or even say it's just not determined yet by science, and say it's basically due to an evolutionary, a lack of evolutionary advantage, or something along these lines. So I think that position should also be taken seriously by our audience as well.
Right.
Yeah.
We do have some audience questions. We're coming up on 2 hours here, the next 9 minutes. Or 8 minutes. So we may want to get some questions in. What do you guys think?
Sounds good.
Okay. So if we have some questions lined up from the audience, we'll go for it. So we have Ron MC who says, so if God's mind is not physical, then every mind needs to be non-physical. What's the contradiction to this? I would think, yeah.
You don't need a contradiction. All you need to say is, given our expectations, what should we expect to see in our minds? So if God is in a material mind who interacts with physical substances all the time, then, he's making people, and we have at least one agent who has interactions with physical substances, then it's not unexpected to see that he would make other agents who also interact with physical substances too, because you already have one on that theory. It's less parsimonious, and it's what you would expect, all things considered. Whereas, yeah, sure, he might make a purely physical being, but why would we postulate that just on theism alone? So it's not based on contradiction, it's based on what would we expect. Ben, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, so I would I tried to head this objection off somewhat in my slides by saying that, look, I'm not claiming that the 5 lines of evidence that I gave in support of my view, I don't claim that they entail or prove there is no non-physical minds. They just contradict that. But that if you accept those lines of evidence, then you just contradict yourself when you say that God or a disembodied mind exists. My claim is more modest than that. It's more evidential. It's that, look, these evidence make it more probable than not, or that these evidences are more likely given physical rather than non-physical, and that the best explanation is the one with the most likely hypothesis, or that it's the most probable on my total evidence when I, factor in things like intrinsic probability and prior probability, that it's just more probable on our total evidence. So I'm not trying to draw out a specific contradiction. I don't think we can make a strong claim like that there's something incoherent with the idea of God being a non-physical mind, but making physical souls. I don't think that entails a contradiction.
Okay. So we have the next comment from, what is it? Sexy Sniper Panda. If your consciousness is your soul and it can be damaged when the brain is damaged, is your soul damaged? I think what was said is souls are consciousness, right?
Yes. So just to clarify that a little bit, I believe certain aspects of consciousness are immaterial, and that's based on functions of the soul. And I think ultimately consciousness as a whole arises between an interplay of the soul and the body. And the things I believe the soul does are pertain to the self. And I think that what pertain to the self and they pertain to the intellect, whereas I think consciousness incorporates a lot more of it. I think some of these things would be, and I think a lot of the other ones would be. Sorry, my girlfriend was messaging me. Subtle brag. I'm sorry. That's one way to break the tension. So the intellect and the self are the two things that operate due to the soul interacting with the body, and the body adds something to consciousness, which is things like memory, things like cognitive and learning power, self-reflection. And I think that the soul can, and I think that the self and the intellect don't really sustain much damage through this, although they can't really express it. But I think that in terms of your own full conscious experience, then yeah, you can be damaged just because of what happens on the physical side of things. But I do ultimately think those things can be rehabilitated. So hopefully that answers the question. I'm sorry, I was a little addled.
Sure, no problem. And we'll try to get to the next question. Did you want to follow up with anything?
I'll just say that I think it's a good question, because it's, do we have dementia in heaven? Like, if our brain is destroyed in this world, and it destroys our mental and psychological properties in this world, are those same mental and psychological properties in heaven also impaired? And I just don't think the substance dualist has a very good answer to this. I know that they can try to give an answer here, but I'm going to be skeptical of that answer, because again, the way that I'm solving the mind-body problem is denying that something like mind is unextended. I want to say, no, it is extended. It's part of the physical world. It is something. And so, yeah, when you damage a brain, you are in a sense damaging the mind. You're damaging something constitutive of the mind, and that person can be gone. We can lose someone forever.
Is the soul responsible for what the body does? Like, is the soul responsible for what you think or what you decide to do?
So ultimately, I think you are responsible for what you decide to do, and what you are is your soul acting through your body. And of course, your consciousness as a whole is due to that interplay between the soul and the body. So that's exactly where I would fall. I think that your power of will and things like that emerge as a result of this. And I think, yeah, if you have a lot of physical and mental impairments that take place, then what ultimately happens is, unless those things are miraculously repaired, yeah, you're not going to you're not really going to have a pleasant afterlife. And my view is God exactly does that during the resurrection. He just places you in a body with a significant portion of your important memories, the ones that exactly made you you, and in addition to the soul that made you you. So Ben alluded to earlier in the discussion about a relationship R with all the personally relevant memory experiences and conscious experience. I think that's actually quite helpful here. I think that those important memories that are really central to your life are just going to be preserved with you. But that's more theological speculation. And you could still hold my thesis without believing in the afterlife. That's purely secondary as well. I don't think I could prove the existence of an afterlife in a debate context, so I'm not going to make any claims there.
Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions. We are coming up to 2 hours, and I have some commitments I have to run off to here. But it was a fascinating debate. I think a lot of people enjoyed it, and I thank you again, you guys, for participating and sharing your thoughts and putting a lot of energy and time into the research. I know you guys must have really prepared for putting this presentation together and your points and everything, and we appreciate you sharing it with the channel. This was really great. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me. And John, thanks for doing this with me again. This is super fun as always.
You too, guys. This is a great platform, and Ben, you're a great interlocutor.
This is awesome. Okay, guys. Well, good night. And until next week, we will see you then. Y'all be good.